Boa tarde a todos, obrigada de novo por estarmos aqui. Eu vou então apresentar agora a sessão da tarde por Marco Baravale e o projeto In Common, as artes performativas em Itália na era das convulsões sociais, com uma priorização muito específica, portanto 1959-1979, que é parte... É um projeto que eu tive o prazer de acompanhar há 3 anos durante a pandemia, quando ainda estava a decorrer. O projeto é ARTHE, que agora já chegou ao seu termo e, portanto, vou ter o prazer de acompanhar e de ver agora os resultados do que foi um projeto longo sobre teatro e política em Itália neste período de 1959 a 79. Marco Baravale é investigador, curador e ativista. Como eu já disse, faz parte do projeto In Common de Annalisa Sacchi, é membro do Sale Docs, um espaço coletivo independente para as artes visuais, ativismo e teatro experimental, localizado no que foi um armazém de sala abandonado em Douro, em Veneza. So, now I'm just presenting Marco Baravale. I was just saying that I think 3 years ago, during the pandemic, I had the pleasure of listening to Marco and Annalisa Sacchi on the In Common project, which was at that time was still going on. Their website wasn't ready yet, and now this is an IRC project that studies theater and politics in Italy between 1959 to 1979. So it has a very specific periodization. I think Marco will tell us a bit about this. And now the project is over, and so I will listen to the results of the project. We all have the pleasure of listening to the results of the project. So Marco Baravale is a researcher, curator, and activist. He's also very well known from this Sale Doc space, an independent, I'm not sure if art space in Venice.
Activist space
as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, first of all. Thank you very much to Anna, Laura, Maria, and all the organizers of ARTHE for having me. So I divided my paper into 3 parts. The first part is going to present the In Common atlas or archive that is online right now. The second part is going to be more theoretical and is going to address some theoretical aspects that we were concerned with during the work of In Common. And finally, the third part is going to analyze one case study which you can also see in the atlas. That is the case study of Giuliano Scabbia. That was my specific focus in the project. So I will also show a 4-minute video that describes how the atlas works. So In Common looks at the scene of theatrical experimentation in Italy in the 60s and the 70s. And it does so with an approach that emphasizes the relational and collaborative forms between the protagonists of the period and attends to the contacts more or less explored between scenic practices and political forms expressed by the struggles and movement active in those years. In Common takes the form, among other things, of a digital atlas that, in addition to valorizing and socializing the archival heritage, tries to imagine a complex exploration of the materials and attempts to bring out the relational complexity that exists between performance, artists, spaces, geography, and the temporality of the events, rethinking and supporting the affective dimension to which the performative event is bound. Let's talk about the architecture of the site. The digital atlas is articulated in different views or entry possibilities. The underlying idea has to do with experimenting with the dynamic use of digital space, thus treating the site not as a repository, an inert container of documentary relics, but as a space in which documents move, activate relationships, create choreographies and visions. So the interface, therefore, invents certain movements that organize the spatial configuration of matter. So if you want to check, the website is, of course, it's going to be in my presentation. It's in-common.org. Unfortunately, it doesn't work on mobile. It only works on laptop, so that's a disclaimer. So I'm going to show now the 4 minutes video.
In Common is the first study to systematically analyze the field of performing arts as resulting from the practice of commonality, both theorized and experienced over the 1960s and the 1970s. In Common's archive contains more than 3,000 documents gathered in cellars and boxes scattered throughout Italy, and it is characterized by a variety of formats and materials. Stage photos, sketches and scripts, invitations and playbills, contracts, private letters, and newspaper articles. The In Common digital archive is not just a showcase of digitized documents. Thanks to a series of visual interventions on the material, it aims at generating unprecedented visions of the period under examination. An almost uchronic operation, which works on the difference between the memory of the show, that perhaps remained alive only in the few who were present, and the generative and imaginative power that can arise from saved documents. The archive is divided into 5 sections, which can be accessed through the main page: Performance Remains, Recomposition, The Shape of Community, Times and Places, Catalog. Performance Remains exploits the metaphor of the table arrangement, where documents are linked by visual similarities measured through computational techniques. This view enables to trace paths that jump from one performance to another and to build connections between documents scattered across time and space. In this section, spatial proximity is an indicator of visual analogies. The arrangement of documents in clusters or constellations supports a looser kind of exploration than that offered by a traditional grid and lends itself to the generation of new narratives. Recomposition plays on the layering of documents as an immersive method. For each case study, the user can explore an interactive mood board made by stacking documents on top of one another, some their original size, others enlarged and cut. The visual accumulation produces interactive collages that bring out the diversity of the materials accompanying each performance. The layering of images acts as a generative device. Layering makes the documents stand out from one another and stimulates new visions of the performance. The Shape of Community visualizes the network of relations emerging from the archive. In the network, people are connected to the events they have participated in. The relationships that link people and events are of different types. The network can be filtered according to these criteria, showing only a portion of the community. A search bar allows the user to search for specific names. Each node of the network can also be inspected to visualize its connections, offering a fluid and frictionless navigation through the community. Times and Places visualizes the geographical and temporal extent of the community emerging from the documents of the archive. The visualization displays the places most affected by the In Common community in different time periods. A map shows the most active cities in the archive, and with a navigation bar, it is possible to observe the changes during the 20 years period under examination. The catalog takes the form of a grid of documents. The materials are presented in casual order and can be selected according to various criteria. This process of shifting meaning, enacted through collection in juxtaposition in grids, resonates with the overall goal of the archive. An invitation to consider the remnants of the performance not as faded memories of the performance, but as new and different objects. The performance remains, but it remains in a different way.
Let's wait for the music to stop. So maybe I can just stop it. Yeah, perfect. So a few more words on the different views that build the atlas. So what you can see here is the page of the catalog, which provide the most traditional access to materials. As you can see, the documents are laid out in a grid in random order and can be filtered through certain categories that are one that you see on the left of the screen. And clicking on individual documents, it opens to a descriptive tab. So there's also a descriptive tab for each of the documents of the atlas. Then we have performance remains, and that is a specialized view of documents, of remnants, of traces that are placed in distance or proximity according to an algorithmic criterion of aesthetic similarity. So there are two algorithms at work here. So one measures the affinity between documents in the collection, encoding certain visual characteristic, while a second one makes the document travel, translating the liquid character of the similarity into hypothesis of spatial distance. So a constellation is generated that mainly brings together documents which are produced with the same graphic or aesthetic style, material belonging to the same archive or created by the same person or collective inevitably attract each other. So this view opens up to possibility of enlargement, even granular enlargement of the documents. Then we do have times and places, and so thanks to the possibility of this vision, each event plunges into its own context and is put in relation with other events, sometimes close or sometimes totally unconnected, occurring in the same geography or temporality. Then the shape of community. So this image is intended to give an account of the relational and affective complexity to which the performance event is bound in those years. The performance is not so much the product of a genius, of an eccentric subject who individually curates the work, but is also the outcome of a broad process of negotiation with relationships, affects, context, politics, and community. So this view tries to unhinge the dual author network dynamic and tries to open up new forms, trajectories, new subjectivities, often neglected by historiography and the classical archive. So here, with the In Common network, we try to include subjectivities marginalized by art historical narration, such as stage photographers, the curators, the critics, who never, as in those years, colluded with the creative processes in a way that is often effective, ephemeral, untraceable, and therefore aborted. So you don't see it from the slide, but actually here you can choose to visualize the sort of historiographic network which was created on the bibliography, and an In Common network which includes those roles that are usually left outside, such exactly as scene photographers, curators, and theater critics. So the last view is called a recomposition, and this view produces like a layering or a superimposition of the documents, and the idea then is that of a decomposable and reconfigurable work, let's say. And also to see how the different documents that relate, for example, to the same performance, visually relate one to each other. So this was a brief description of the archive, and I'm going to the second part. So in the second part, I will try to highlight a series of theoretical problems that informed In Common's approach to creating the atlas. And I will refer, and I apologize, to very well-known performance studies positions on the problem of archiving performance, but I will do it in order to trigger a dialogue between these positions that you know perfectly and others coming from different fields, from fields such as visual arts, in particular from curatorial practices, but also from Italian post-workerism, from decolonial and African-American studies. So As we know, when the subject is the archiving of performance, one is typically confronted with a conundrum that appears at the intersection of two very well-beaten tracks. So the first path starts often, or very often starts, from the notion of the archive as treated by Jacques Derrida and his interrogation of the etymology of the term that includes both commencement and commandment. In addition, it is today impossible to ignore the role of archives in modernity as imperial dispositives fundamental for sustaining the colonial order. And we have, of course, tons of literature on the topic. I think, for example, of Anna Laura Stoller, which researched the colonial nature of modern archive, and also the fact that Stoller sees the authoritarian nature of the archive stretching itself far beyond the colonial era into late capitalism. And she writes, "The imperial archive was both the supreme technology of the late 19th century imperial state and the telling prototype of a postmodern one, predicated on global domination of information and the circuits through which facts move." So, I mean, it's interesting, this let's say, resilience of the archive as an imperial dispositive. So the second path moves from the territories of performance studies. It meanders from Richard Schechner down to a range of scholars, including Diana Taylor, Peggy Phelan, Rebecca Schneider, José Esteban Munoz, and many others. So along this trail, one inevitably encounters concepts such as immateriality, disappearance, ephemerality, loss, and those concepts animate an ontological debate on what performance is. So, and the feminist ontology that Phelan brings to light is one where being unmarked is revalued and presented as a liberatory and subversive character. Performance, Phelan tells us, is unmarked because it is impossible to reproduce it, to copy it, to save it, or to archive it. Or better, when one does it, performance turns into something else. So the specific potenza, the potentiality of performance, is that of occupying what she calls a maniacally charged present. The now of the life is described by Phelan as a plunge into visibility. After that plunge, though, performance disappears into memory, into the realm of invisibility and the unconscious, where it eludes regulation and control. This is why, the scholar argues, performance does not participate in capitalistic accumulation, and it is at odds with finance and its drive towards speculation. In a kind of entropic economy, performance, and again I quote, saves nothing, it only spends. So turning to a concept coined by Fred Moten, it could be said that for Phelan, performance presents a fugitive ontology, even when it is not strictly related to blackness. Its bulk is ungraspable by reproduction, inextricably bound up with presence. It is an irreducible difference that cannot be patriarchally marked as the same. It is always already somewhere else when the capitalistic valorization machine tries to get a hold on it. Its disappearing nature escapes the pitfalls of visibility that, according to the scholar, does not equate to political empowerment. So, and despite Phelan brilliantly discloses the oppositional edge of performance, this is how she defines it, I must admit I have a certain difficulty in accepting too linearly the idea that it stems that this oppositional edge stems from its immateriality, especially in light of the fact that the immaterial or immateriality has been, as post-workerists argue, the center of a new valorization process in the shift to cognitive capitalism. At the beginning of the new millennium, in his book, A Grammar of the Multitude, Paolo Virno argues that it is exactly the performative model of the virtuoso that becomes the model for labor in general. This fact signals how labor was getting closer to performance and politics, as it was more and more requested to happen in the public space, that is, in the presence of others, to be relational and to leave no end product behind. Of course, Virno also tells us that while post-Fordist capital knows how to profit from immateriality, so from language, from effects, from relations, etc., the multitude of cognitarian workers does have in itself the potentiality to make exodus, to flee. That is, to subtract itself from capitalistic exploitation and to organize more just social models. So Virno then suggests a more nuanced understanding of immateriality, especially immateriality in today's society, not as a marked character, but instead as a battleground between capitalistic valorization and the common. But coming back to performance studies and the archive, the unarchivable character of performance is highlighted by Diana Taylor too, but contrary to Phelan, the former sees a possible aftermath for bodily grammars in the repertoire. Famously, the repertoire differs from the archive because it is an embodied memory and it requires presence. Rebecca Schneider, for her part, sees things differently. While she as well recognizes the imperial and authoritarian history of what she called the archival logic, unlike Taylor, she is not ready to give up the archive in exchange for the repertoire. More importantly, unlike Phelan, Schneider does not equate performance with disappearance. First, she argues that at least the life of dramatic theater can be understood as the remain of a text. But most of all, she asks, and I quote, "It is not the case that it is precisely the logic of the archive that approaches performance as disappearance. Asked another way, does an equation of performance as impermanence, distraction, and loss follow rather than disrupt a cultural habituation to the imperialism inherent in archival logic?" End quote. As an answer to this question, Schneider suggests the possibility of understanding performance as archive. She says that instead of disappearance and immateriality, the bodies of the performers and the mutual interactions are the locus where remains remain differently. Schneider also argues that archives work as places where bones retain the memory of the flesh, but not vice versa. Again, I quote, "In the archive, flesh is given to be that which slips away. According to archive logic, flesh can house memory of bone. In the archive, only bone speaks memory of flesh." End quote. So, keeping this in mind, it is interesting to note that in her last book, that is titled Programme de désordre absolu and a Program of Absolute Disorder, Françoise Vergès addresses the problem of the impossible decolonization of the European Universal Museum. So museums, of course, are not archives, but they can have their own archives and are anyway places where objects are stored, where catalogs and taxonomies are formed. So Vergès underlines how many European museums still host thousands of human remains, mainly bones and especially skulls in their collection. So, and she calls this the most frightening treasure of colonial violence and looting. So, seen under this decolonial light, Schneider's reference to the ossified nature of the archive acquires a literal urgency, much more than a metaphorical one. So, anyway, Schneider is telling us that the fugitivity of performance is not an act of resistance against the capturing appetite of the archive. In fact, it's the archive itself that asks performance and bodies to disappear, to disperse into immateriality, so to peacefully exercise its nationalistic, imperialistic, and patriarchal functions. But looking at performances of historical reenactment, Schneider does not see loss. On the contrary, she sees alternative ways to keep memory alive, and she writes, quote, "In such practices, coded like the body as primitive, folk, and naive, performance does not remain, or performance does remain, does leave residue. Indeed, the place of residue is arguably flesh in a network of body-to-body transmissions of effect and enactment, evidence across generations of impact." And speaking of performing the archive, Marco Scotini, an Italian curator who has extensively reflected on the relationship between art and the archive for the last two decades, frames the paradox emerging when the archive leaves the bureaucratic field and shifts to aesthetics. So when this happens, the colonial, nationalistic, archontic function of the archive is turning on its head. In the hands of the artist, and sometimes of the curator, the archives becomes, and I quote, a means of subversion and liberation from social roles, gender identities, crystallized past, forms of subordination, heteronymous representation, end quote. So according to Scottini, the non-narrative structure of the archive is what has made it, both as a physical and a theoretical space, the ideal locus for counter-memories, the lens through which deconstructing the idea of a monotemporal, universal, and linear history. So the non-narrative structure of the archive is what gives it this, nature of the ideal place for expressing counter-memories against the modern theological idea of history. So, moreover, the aesthetic counter-use of archives in the era of digital technologies runs parallel to a complete change of status of the document. And this is the other original contribution, I think, by Scottini. So, today, the development of digital technologies, the curator argues, crumbles the credibility of the document. Once the bearer of truth, the unquestioned conveyor of political power over memory, it is now the usual suspect of fabrication, modification, and perversion. So the contemporary archival impulse in the arts would in fact be fueled by the very loss of the archive's object. So another disappearance, but this time that of the document. Let's summarize. According to Schneider, then, the body is an archive through which performance remains. For Scottini, artists employ an archival logic or work with documents in actual archives, transforming them in sites where counter-memories get their revenge on history. So these are two possible modes of performing the archive. And even Phelan, by inviting to see writing about performance as a performative act, implicitly leaves the door open to a possibility of work exposed on the radical disappearance of performance. If one can write about it, as long as one is aware that he or she is not reproducing that experience, but rather testing the performative possibilities of writing itself, then why not thinking about archiving performance in the same way? Of course, not all people composing or working with archives or of live and visual arts are artists. Not all archival interventions are meant to be artistic. Not all archives are works of art, and performance as archive does not substitute archives of performance. But we shall again follow Scottini when he writes that the paradigmatic shift of the archive from the scientific to the aesthetic, and I quote, should prevent us from maintaining the distinction between art and science, which as such would end up reconfirming the alleged modernist objectivity, at a time when the very idea of evidence, or that of the opposition between art and fiction, subject and object, art or document, has definitely entered into crisis. So, end quote. Under this light, any type of work that deals with actual archives, documents, or archival mode of composition, any activity that involves archiving, consulting, cataloging, no matter if it is performed under the banner of art or science, can potentially find ways to perform the archive. Think, for example, of critical fabulation, the methodology developed, among others, by Saidiya Hartman. So in order to be able to write about the radical and rebel character of the lives of black women of the past, Hartman integrates archival documents with fiction. And I think it is worthy to indulge in quoting a few excerpts from the methodological note that opens her book, Wayward Life's Beautiful Experiments, where she successfully redeems the memory of black women at the turn of the 20th century from the discipline imposed over them by archives. It is also interesting that this undertaking is developed to a certain extent through the study and the fabulation of the dimension of intimacy, a space that is impossible to disconnect from bodies and from seeing the body as a social battleground. So, while it is no surprise that an attempt at black feminist microhistory keeps the body at the center, it is worth noting that Hartman seems in tune with Taylor's idea of the repertoire, and she digs to bring to light the bodily memory of the flesh, that flesh which finds no space in between the bones filling the archive. So Hartman notes, every story on the multitude, the dispossessed, the subaltern, and the enslaved is forced to grapple with the power and the authority of the archive and the limits it sets on what can be known, whose perspective matters, and who is endowed with the gravity and authority of historical actor. And she goes on explaining, and I'm quoting a quite long part, but I think it's an amazing piece of text, so I think it's worth quoting it. So she writes, all the characters and events found in this book are real, none are invented. What I know about the lives of these young women has been culled from the journals of rent collectors, surveys and monographs of sociologists, trial transcripts, slum photographs, reports of investigators, social workers, and parole officers, interviews with psychiatrists and psychologists, and prison case files, all of which represent them, the black women, as a problem. I have crafted a counter-narrative liberated from the judgment and classification that subjected young black women to surveillance, arrest, punishment, and confinement, and offer an account that attends to beautiful experiments to make living an art, undertaken by those often described as promiscuous, reckless, wild, and wayward. The endeavor is to recover the insurgent ground of these lives, to exhume open rebellion from the case file, to untether waywardness, refusal, mutual aid, and free love from their identification as deviance, criminality, and pathology, to affirm free motherhood, intimacy outside the institution of marriage, and queer and outlaw passions, and to illuminate the radical imagination and everyday anarchy of ordinary colored girl, which has not only been overlooked, but is nearly unimaginable. Wayward Lives elaborates, augments, transposes, and breaks open archival documents so that might yield a richer picture of the social upheaval that transformed black social life in the 20th century. In this spirit, I have pressed at the limit of the case file and the document, speculated about what might have been imagined, the thing whispered in dark bedrooms, and amplified moments of withholding, escape, and possibility, moments when the visions and dreams of the wayward seemed possible. So, end quote. Hartman shows us how a historiographic work can be carried on through an action of performing archives of constituted powers, exceeding them to get access to those memories that they are supposed not to retain when not to directly erase. So said, luckily we know that not all archives are the same. Not all of them have been put together and nurtured by constituted powers such as the state or disciplinary institutions such as police or psychiatry. Think of social movements, socialist, anarchist, feminist, collective, queer, avant-garde art, black archives. Maybe it could be said that such archives are always already the result of a certain performative, subversive, deterrent approach to the disciplinary nature of the modern Western archive. Anyway, we all know how precious these places are. I think, for example, of how the self-managed and militant archive Archivio Moroni in Milano has been instrumental after the repression of the Italian social movements of the 70s to retain the counter-memory of the autonomia and to oppose the criminalization of the memory of that movement that was performed by the state apparatus, included its archives. But what would happen then if all of a sudden the usual activist management of their archive would become too heavy to bear for the generous comrades who have taken care of it for decades on a volunteering base? And what would happen if, for example, a big global institution would offer to buy the archive or simply would accept to host it? It could be an Ivy League college in the US, a rich art foundation, or a famous museum in the global north. Sure, hopefully, best case scenario, such an acquisition would result in an acceleration of the digitization of documents, a wider global accessibility of items, a new impulse in academic research. But what would happen to the situatedness of that archive? To the complexity of the local counter-memories it shelters? What would happen to its common and subversive character? And I think these are worth asking questions, because if we narrow our field of analysis to the cases of radical artist archives, often organized as collectives, especially but not only archives from the global south, we can detect a widespread process of cultural extractivism where a growing number of the aforementioned archives are bought by institutions of the global north. So in opposition to this extractivist tendency, it is worth recalling the experience of the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, especially its collaboration with the Red Conceptualismos del Sur around the archive of CADA. CADA, which stands for Colectivo Acciones de Arte, is a group, a Chilean group, that use performance and theatricality as a means to oppose the Pinochet regime in Chile. And it has put together a substantial archive of its history. The Red Conceptualismos del Sur is a network of Latin American scholars founded in 2007 around the study of militant Latin American art and the urgency of avoiding the dispersion of its many archives. So, the collaboration between La Red and the Reina Sofia Museum was inspired by a theoretical reflection carried along a series of seminars titled Archives of the Commons. And the title already implicitly suggests the possibility of untying the dispositive of the archive from constituted power and to consider it as a common, that is, as a space where the memories of the subalterns, of those who opposed the violent affirmation of neoliberalism in the 70s, could not only be preserved without being fetishized, but also, hopefully, could socially perform their dissonance once again. And Manuel Borja Villar, the former director of Reina Sofia, he has been directing the museum for the last 15 years, basically, writes, and I quote, "In 2010, the Museo Reina Sofia's collection was totally reorganized, and CADA's actions were given a preferential place in it. However, it was essential that their inclusion in the collection was done according to the principles agreed by the Red Conceptualismos del Sur. For both parties, it was imperative that the archives remain intact in their place of origins, not out of fetishism, but because that context gave meaning to their possible activations. An archive that is not continuously activated and reactivated is a mere accumulation of documents, objects, and paper. So to this end, alliances were sought with local institutions willing to house documentary collections. Organizational forms like association or foundation were considered that would guarantee the participation of artists and heirs of the Red and finally of the Reina Sofia itself in its governance. That would consolidate the stability of the fund and avoid its excessive patrimonialization. It was also essential that the collection were available to all, not only in the sense that they were accessible, but their nomenclature, methodology, and method of cataloging and ordering also had to be shared and negotiated between the members of the Red and other bodies, given that a concrete action in Chile acquires a different meaning that it might elsewhere. So this necessarily entails self-reflection and the constant rethinking of concepts and dispositives, end quote. So Borja, in my opinion, is responsible for another possible version of performing the archive, namely the use he makes of the document not in the archive but directly in the museum collection. Indeed, he has often brought the document out of the archive and inserted it in the exhibition space. By doing so, Borja is conscious of fueling an ambiguity between the document and the work of art. For example, he emphasizes the collaboration with the artists of CADA in choosing a certain numbers of documents, which are typically the photographic and video documentations of their actions, that, in order to find their place in the collection, would acquire the status of proper works of art. But this is not the most interesting aspect for me. What I like to underline here is that when he uses archival documents or documents as quasi-works of arts in the exhibition space, the effect is that they haunt the other exhibited pieces by diffusing the risk of their fetishization, by sabotaging their reception as autonomous objects, torn from social history and the unique fruit of individual genius. In such a way, we're not only confronted with what Scottini describes as the present fragility of the document, so its uncertain relation to truth, but also with the fragility of the autonomous conception of the work of art and the fetishization of its author that is breached by the very presence of the document. In this particular relationship, therefore, the reification of the document does not prevail. So it's not really that the danger that the document turns into a work of art and gets fetishized is, I think, diffused by this sort of dialectical relation with the art piece within the exhibition space. On the contrary, elements usually connected to performance, that is the ephemeral, the collective, the fugitive, and the concatenation between aesthetics and politics, break the isolation classically produced by the museum, its tombal and sacral aura. Of course, this is only possible if the document does not occupy an ancillary position to the work of art, if the former threatens the status of the latter. So, and I will go to my last part of this paper, in which I focus on the case study I addressed in the work of In Common, just to give you an example of how we worked with the documents that we collected and how we try to perform them, let's say. So, in the context of In Common, I focused on Giuliano Scabbia, more specifically on a project that is titled The Decentralization Actions of the Teatro Stabile in Turin, developed between 1969 and 1970s. The research, and 1970, sorry. The research took place mostly at Giuliano Scabbia's private archive, where the artist, still alive at the time of the research, would always welcome me and my colleagues. Oh, I don't have I thought I have a couple of pictures of his archive. Unfortunately, I don't. Anyway, so Scabbia's extensive material archive, art housed in his Florentine residence, unfolded along the horizontal plane of affections in his narratives. It presented a tacit agreement for consultations. Access to the archive was granted in exchange for engaging in a conversation not only with Scabbia, but also with the multitude of absentees summoned by the documents. Meticulously curated, Scabbia used the documents as spurs to delve into the repository of his memories. For instance, a photo taken in Genova in the 60s prompted him to reconstruct the story of the photographer, Lisetta Carmi, for whom he immediately looked up the phone number in his agenda and then called to have her provide us an alternative perspective on their shared experience of 6 years ago. So, and this is the place where, in conversation with Scabbia and the documents, also the radicality of the decentralization actions of 1969 began to surface. So in 1969, radical theater organizer Edoardo Fadini was given the task by the Teatro Stabile of Turin to design its decentralization program. I know that Portuguese are familiar with what decentralization is, but I didn't know if everybody else is familiar with the term. So in a nutshell, decentralization is a term defining a series of actions through which public theaters try to reach new subaltern audiences, typically the proletarian population of working class neighborhoods in the cities. In the 60s and the 70s, pushed by the growing social mobilization and by a new request for culture, decentralization became one of the main concerns of Italian theaters. Fadini, the organizer of the Teatro Stabile in Turin, opted for the involvement of Giuliano Scabbia, back then a 34-year-old poet who was soon to be recognized as one of the seminal figures of the Italian theatrical avant-garde. And Turin was, at the time, one of the hotbeds of social struggles, particularly due to the presence of Fiat, the main national car factory. So the post-war economic boom was changing the face of entire cities, especially those in the northern part of the country. The galloping industrialization of places like Genova and Milano demanded fresh labor force, triggering a massive movement of internal migration from the south. This demographic boom was mainly fed by migrants from southern regions who, in a general climate of racism and suspect, were amassed in peripheral neighborhoods of recent construction. Desolate housing estates with overcrowded apartments in areas poorly connected to the center, lacking schools and services, pure dormitories for the manpower employed at Fiat. So the operaisti, a group of unorthodox Marxist intellectuals gathered around the magazine Quaderni Rossi, the red notebooks, had sensed the subversive potential of this new typology of worker, who they named operaio massa, the mass worker. Typically young and immigrant, he or she was very different from the professional workers of the early post-war period, politicized and proud of their professionalism. The biggest difference from the previous generation laid in the so-called refusal of work, a detachment from the traditional values of the official labor movement that would, in fact, prove to be one of the most radical features of the movement of the 60s and the 70s in Italy. So, during the 60s, this new class composition, to use another term borrowed from the operaista jargon, had been showing the propension to autonomously engage in a series of radical conflicts with their capitalistic counterpart. And the perfect storm of 1968 resulted from the alliance between the workers' movement and the students' movement. It was triggered by what the French sociologists Yves Chiapelot and Luc Boltanski defined the coming together of social and artistic critique. It was indeed a transversal assembly called Assemblée Operai Studenti, the Workers' and Students' Assembly, that decided to organize an autonomous demonstration against the rising costs of rents in Turin. The demonstration took place on the 3rd of July 1969. The protesters gathered in front of the entrance number 2 of the Fiat factory in Mirafiori, a working-class neighborhood grown around the presence of Fiat, and started to march. The rally was immediately attacked by the police in Corso Traiano. The clashes lasted all night long, eventually leading to 200 wounded among the participants and 30 arrests. The revolt of Corso Traiano marked the beginning of what became known as the Autunno Caldo, the hot autumn. Indeed, during the fall of 1969, the movement grew in radicality and number to such an extent that it forced the Italian state to make important concessions. For example, the Statute of Workers, a 1970 law that made substantial improvements in labor law. So it was against this background that Giuliano Scabbia started his work in Turin that would last 6 months, from November 1969 to April 1970. And previously, and this is very important, previously to his arrival, Fadini and the Teatro Stabile had already organized a series of assemblies in 4 working-class districts with the goal of creating a dialogue and gathering answers about the expectation of the different local communities. The idea of proceeding through open assemblies involving local actors was certainly influenced by the historical conjuncture. The movement of 1969 popularized collective decision-making processes in factories, schools, political organizations, neighbors, and a few years later in feminist self-awareness groups. In this collectivist wave, the assembly represented the main technology of self-government. It therefore made sense for a theater, when designing its decentralization policies, to make use of it. What's more, Fadini's work responded to a concept of decentralization that was radically different from the traditional one, which, although inspired by the desire to democratize the theatrical institution, was mainly aimed at reaching new audiences by shifting to the margins what was being produced in the center, leaving the latter totally unquestioned. And we have many examples of the debate around decentralization in Italy in the 60s and the 70s. For example, in 1976, Gigi Livio, a theater critic for Turin, argues that decentralization shall not understand people fascisticamente, that is, in a fascist way. It should not understand people fascistically as an object to be reached, but it should, on the contrary, grant it the status of the subject. This is exactly the way Fadini thought of his mission in Turin. And I quote a text by Fadini. The difference with this kind of colonialist operation, and when he speaks of colonialist operation, he thinks of traditional decentralization, simply moving central performances to the peripheries without questioning what is produced by the center, what is produced by the center. So he says the difference with this kind of colonialist operation lies, as I said, in the concept of participation, naturally understood in its strict political sense. By participation, we in fact meant in Turin, and he explained what it means by the participation in Turin. First, a real connection with the grassroots organization of the population in the neighborhoods. Then an analysis of the movements of struggles where they were present in the neighborhoods. And finally, a type of collective work, where possibly assembly-based, in which all the protagonists of the initiatives, that is technicians, performers, neighborhood inhabitants, would merge as much as possible. Of course, underlying these three directions of work was a precise political discriminating factor. And it is as follows. The four chosen neighborhoods were and are considered to be home to working class population. Therefore, proposals, discussion, choices, and working methods all had to be informed by a single commissioner, the working class. So again, there's a sort of turning things upside down. The working class population is not the object of decentralization, but becomes the commissioner of decentralization. So once in Turin, Scabbia founded 4 attivi teatrali, that is 4 open assemblies, one for each working class neighborhood interested by decentralization. Scabbia was also assisted by the so-called research group, formed by a group of professional actors. And Scabbia leaves behind an amazing and detailed account and diary of those months, which is included in its amazing book, Teatro nello spazio degli scontri, Theater in the Space of Struggles, that unfortunately is only available in Italian. And in the detailed diary of those months, what emerges is the laborious but exciting work the research group did in assemblies attended by students, priests, political activists, feminist workers, housewives, and school teachers. So, despite a climate of growing tension, as it will be later addressed more in detail between the poet and the Teatro Stabile, and especially with Edoardo Fadini, because what came out of this was a very difficult relationship by these two very radical protagonists of that moment. So, despite the climate of growing tension between the poet and the Teatro Stabile, and between the poet and some of the assemblies, at the end of this experience in Turin, Scabbia had produced 3 performances, one street action, and 1 film newsreels. So these are the images of the archive that I thought I had to show before. The guy is not Giuliano Scabbia, is a colleague of mine. I did not ask his permission to be shown, so I hope he doesn't mind. The legendary Stefano Brilli bragging in Scabbia's archive. So anyway, I will show here some of the images of some of the actions by the Teatro by Scabbia during the decentralization in Turin. So the first performance is titled 600 and Thousands, and it is an example of documentary theater on the aforementioned revolt of Corso Traiano. During the performance, the actors were joined by people who actually took part of the demonstration, such as one man who was arrested during the clashes. Scabbia left open the possibility that the performance could be interrupted to make rooms for moments of assembly. Indeed, one of the pictures on the occasion portrayed the poet sitting on a stage facilitating a collective discussion, which is, I don't know if I have it here. Yes, this one. This was Scabbia in 1969. And this is an example, what you see on the screen is an example of why a project such as the Atlas, the Incommon Atlas, can be useful for researchers, because the image per se was not unknown, was already, for example, archived not only in Scabbia's private archive, but also in the archive of the Teatro Stabile in Turin. But what we did was also to scan the verso of the photography, which has this manuscript text by Scabbia, which describes the moment of the performance. And we learn from his writing that is the direct witnesses of one of the people who participated in the demonstration of the 3rd of July. It's just ended. His name was Cosimo Colazzo, and was inserted live in this theatrical documentary. Another action, another performance is titled Un nome così grande, such a big name. This is the translation, inspired by the book Letter to a Teacher, written by the progressive priest Don Lorenzo Milani in collaboration with his students at the primary school in Barbiana. So here Scabbia wants to highlight the classic structure of Italian school and the pervasive power of fiat in Turin. This time the actors share the stage with a puppet theater, one of the recurrent tools in Scabbia's participatory poetics. Then there are other actions that I'm not describing, but the last one, a very important one, is this one. And this was titled, this was a non-stop 33 hours long action created by Assemblea Teatro, which was an independent group who participated in one of the assemblies facilitated by Giuliano Scabbia. And the action was titled Closed War System. So it took place in the municipality building of Le Vallette, transformed on the occasion in a psychiatric hospital with wards, a room for solitary confinement, a prison, toilets, and a room that hosted a permanent assembly moderated by Giuliano Scabbia himself. The performance is clearly inspired by Living Theatre's The Brick from 1963, and actors impersonate interned patients, doctors and guards, stressing the violence of the disciplinary institution. In addition, the space hosts documentary photographs, slides, and films. And I cut another part. But as mentioned above, researching Scabbia's private archive, a series of tensions emerge. It's really clear. So, and a series of tensions between Scabbia and Fadini, that is between the artist and the institution, or between the Attivo delle Vallette and Scabbia, that is between the assembly and the artist. And despite or maybe exactly because Scabbia chose to maintain the participatory framework inaugurated by the Teatro Stabile, the tension between him and Fadini, generated by a sense of excessive control exercised by the institution of the artist and by the issue of the paternity of the project, built during the months, as evidenced by a furious typewritten letter found in the poet's private archive addressed to Fadini. Scabbia writes to Fadini in this letter that I found in his private archive concerning the paternity of the actions of the decentramento. And I quote, "I am extremely bitter and nauseated by the situation that has arisen, not least because I see that I risk throwing 4 months of ideas and invention to the pigs, and I do not work for pigs. At most, I occasionally eat slices of salami, which are minced pork. Goodbye." Okay. On the other hand, part of the Attivo delle Vallette, one of the assemblies, felt expropriated by Scabbia's cumbersome individuality. This is an excerpt of another letter found in the poet's archive, sent by the Attivo, by the assembly, to the press and the directors of the Teatro Stabile as a response to an article on the decentralization actions. And the assembly writes, "The Attivo Teatrale delle Vallette considers it appropriate to correct the statements reported in the article itself and supported by the Stabile's collaborator, Mr. Giuliano Scabbia, according to which Mr. Scabbia himself is the creator of the theatrical action entitled The Alienating Power Relationship represented by Bus 59, staged at Le Vallette. This action is actually the result of a group work in which Mr. Scabbia participated only in a small part and which he abandoned long before its realization, despite repeated invitations and the commitment he made to the theatrical Attivo itself." So, and these letters are not mentioned because as such they would help to clarify the contours of certain professional and creative relationships. Or better, they do so, but this is not the point I want to make. First of all, it is my conviction that despite their disagreements, both Fadini's institutional courage and Scabbia's questioning of the hegemonic understanding of theater were both instrumental in giving birth to an example of radical participatory art. Second, an affective reading of archives is no sentimental endeavor. Feelings, relations, and intimacy are not excuses to linger on philological gossip or cornerstones on which temples of the cult of personality can be built. On the contrary, by turning materialistically to archives as affective maps, it is possible to resonate what is at first glance absent, the social, historical, collective, and relational fabric in which artistic creation finds its common ontology, invisible to disciplinary approaches. So for this reason, the tensions emerging from Scabia's archive testify of a historical moment of general questioning and fibrillation of the institutional framework, of the idea of art labor as something exceptional and free from the grip of a capitalist exploitation, and of the secured borders of the work of art. Radical experiments in decentralization, like the one set up in Turin, are those time spaces where this fibrillation is taken to its limits. This happens because in these rare cases, social, political, and aesthetic margins are not summoned in paternalistic terms, but in terms that actually challenge established cultural structures, aesthetics, and hierarchies. It is then the common, collective, and affective creativity of the margins that reclaims its space and its subversive potential, and I'm closing. So Scabbia was absolutely aware of this subversive potentiality of the margins. Indeed, in another text, he recalls the night of 1968 in Milano when he visited Giancarlo Celli, the founder of the Dioniso Group, who was living in a squatted hotel. 1969 in some peripheral neighborhood in Milano in a squatted hotel. And Scabbia writes, the hotel, abandoned and ready for demolition, was occupied by young and old who stayed there in abandoned rooms, mattresses, and cots, between green walls, talking and dreaming a lot, sometimes in delirium. Here are the margin, goes on Scabbia, places of semi-spontaneous action often mediated by the political, center and margin of the city, searching for radically different places that were often where we came from, and sometimes we hid this out of shame. Tasting the language of the margins, tasting the language of the margin, which was the emerging everyday language. To enter with the theater into an explored space, or perhaps where we belong. Romanticism of illusory spaces, metrics and rhythm, the metrics in Milan of the outer ring road, poetry theater beyond the Baggina and San Donato. Linguistic romanticism, the horizon, boundary, suddenly changes place, and every place suddenly seems to come alive, to appear and ask questions. Everywhere seems to see small groups of writing, politics, theater, animation, discussion, friendship, initiative, preaching, affectivity, illusion, end quote. So, and I think it is by accepting the challenge of this molecular wave of groups of militant friends, lovers, artists, and dreamers that the trajectory of Scabbia intersect the Kunstwelle of 1968. It is this revolution of politics and everyday life that stresses institutional structures and roles, short-circuiting them. So, well, in conclusion, if I can hope something for the Incommon Atlas, I hope that it looks more like a squatted hotel than a police station to its own documents. I hope it remains marginal, not out of poverty fetishism, but because, as Bell Hooks reminds us, margins invite the creation of communities of resistance. I hope it retains the messy open character of an assembly, the fleshy feeling of bringing a collective act of revolt to present. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marco Baravalle, for your really interesting lecture. Let's see if you have now we will put the debate in common with the audience and see if you have questions.
Well, I think we can wait until we have questions. It was really rich and intense, and we had several layers of discussion. I myself am trying to, but actually I think this is more of a comment, and I think which is that something your project have in common with our project, which is the fact that it's dealing with a very intense historical period, like hot autumn, we have hot summer, verão quente, and it's also these moments of emergence of speech. So a lot of people are speaking a lot, and a lot of people who didn't speak for 40 years, 48 years. So we have this problem of, at the same time, a multiplicity of voices, and on the other hand, the people trying to articulate and then reinventing another language to reinvent another word. So I think this is, I don't know if I know you've just told us, but how do you see this as a problem? How can we give an account of this? And somehow even all the graphics, all the multiplicity of, I don't know if you've thought of this in these terms.
I don't know. We were confronted with the task of archiving a period, despite only from the point of view of performance or performing arts, but archiving a period that has been really, whose memory has been really sort of damned by the official Italian historiography. The 70s are only described as the years of Leeds, so so a period in which only violence ruled, and all the incredible revolutionary aspects that invested everyday life, and that in a way also invested the arts and performing arts, were totally erased and cancelled from memory. But what we wanted to try, at least to try to do with the In Common archive, was to create a mode of archivation that communicates the fact that back then people were collectively creating a revolutionized way of life, and that really structured, even institutional structure in the art field were stressed, were put under pressure, were also overwhelmed by this revolutionary movement that in Italy, by the way, was pretty long, because in Italy said that we had the long 68. Mm-hmm. So basically, mobilization lasted from early 68, the first months of 1968, until 1977, basically. So that's why we tried with the different views of In Common to at least try to convey through the document the radicality of what happened in Italy back then, and not to simply, of course, not to impose any discipline on the documents, but also not to convey a pacified memory of those documents, because it wasn't pacified at all. What Giuliano Scabbia did in Turin during the decentralization actions is incredible, and I think that some young students today, it's really hard for her to actually understand the magnitude of that oppositional attitude that project embodied. So that's why we insisted on the relational structure of the visualization of documents. That is why we insisted on the shape of community, to affirm this common ontology of art in general and performance art in particular.
Questions? One question.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed hearing both about the archive, but also about the contextualization of it, and then the case study. So it seems to me that you've made an archive that can make new understandings of the works that are represented within it. So I would like to ask you a question about your experience of interacting with it in common, and what new understandings or emergent things that you didn't know about that period and the art making and the performance have come out of the particular structure of the archive that you have made. Thank you.
Basically, I learned everything because I come also because of a disciplinary barrier. I come from the visual arts, so I was happily borrowed to performance studies for 3 years, but I had to learn everything basically. What I learned, for example, is that again the participatory theater that Giuliano Scabbia enacts in Turin, it is very, very, of course, very urgent today when we think of debates about participation in art and theater in the present. So we are used to, we are used to see the artist as a sort of mediator of participation, you know, using participation as a mediating tool, pretty often to mediating conflicts, to avoid conflicts, or to pacify, or to say it probably better, to rebuild the broken social fabric of our communities. Well, I think that this is a pretty problematic position for an artist to be. First of all, because it is, again, the idea that the artist that come to a certain community is not on the same level. It's above, looks the community from above, and there's also like a disqualification of conflict as immediately as a negative feature. While if you look at how Scabbia interpreted participation, interpreted as a way to sort of make social fracture worse. He thought participation as a class weapon, as a way to, first of all, to test political theater. First of all, to break with the hegemonic idea of theater and to learn from the workers and from the assemblies. But at the same time, it was clear that his theater wasn't a mediating tool. It was another tool that participated into class struggle, for example. So I think that is why I think this was an act of radical participatory theater, and I think that this difference is very relevant in today's debate on participation in the arts. Also, Scabbia has some similarities with. Scabbia wasn't a workerist. He met Toni Negri, for example, but was never part of that group. But what is interesting is that the way he also writes about his experience in his diary, it is pretty close to what the workerists in those years were calling co-research, or militant investigation. So working with the workers and not on the workers, as the scholars of the official workers' movement were usually doing the same period. So he says, my theater learns from workers' knowledge. That is totally different from something very famous, much more famous, which happened in theater only 1 year before during the Paris May, when Living Theater, of course, got stuck in the middle of the Paris May, and there is a diary of Living Theater where Julian Beck writes, I want to teach workers what beauty is, because workers have no idea of what beauty is. So I also learned, that there are differences in interpreting this merging of life and theater, which was so common during those years. So these are two things, but I could tell many more. Yeah.
No, for me.
I want to ask you if the diary of Scabia is online at the Atlas.
I mean, no, the diary is included in a book that you can actually buy. It's an amazing book. It's called Teatro nello spazio degli scontri, Theater in the Space of Struggles. It's only in Italian, but you can buy it, and there's the whole diary. But what we have in the archive is hundreds of pages of notebook written by Scabia during those very years, and all these notebooks have been the object of metadatation. So you don't have to, you have to read Italian, of course, but you don't have to go through each page. Let's say that each notebook has been read by us, and we have been working on metadatation, so that we tell you from this page to this page is this, then it's this, then it's this. So, yeah.
And about the book you published last year, I think in Fiamme, it's all centered in the work.
It's a collective book which was curated.
It's a beautiful and a big book.
Yeah. That was curated by Annalisa Sacchi, who was the principal investigator of the project, by Piersandra Di Matteo, and by Ilenia Caleo.
I think so.
I think yes. I'm not forgetting anyone. And it should have been the result of a big conference that we were thinking, but then the conference was not lucky because we had the huge floods in Venice in 2019 and then pandemic, so we didn't do the conference, but we did the book, and it collects, I think, 30 or more contributions basically on the topics and on the content of the archive. Yes.
A question.
Here. In fact, it's not a question, it's more a compliment because it's so, of course, I think everybody will check the website and navigate towards the documents, but it's this kind of challenge that you present, you make to us also to be in so accordance with the material, with the documents, with their, and create a forms that are in really deep relationship with this, with the themes, and so yes, I think it's a challenge, and it's a very good challenge for us also, not capturing the documents or restraining them to boxes or even in the web. So this is great, yeah.
Thank you. This is actually what we were trying to do, and yes, again, conscious that history does not repeat itself, conscious that we're not reproducing what the performances were, but conscious that we need to be complicit with their dissonance. I guess this is this. We didn't want them to stop vibrating. That was our main concern in treating the documents that we managed, because we felt complicit with the documents, and I think that this also makes a big difference when you can relate in a very deep way to the document that you're treating, not as bones, but as flesh.
We have another question there, I think, Vicky.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. Actually, what really interested me was this kind of tension between two men who were both fighting for a particular cause, but fighting in a very different way. And it seems as though one, Fadini was fighting it more long term, and Scabia comes in and fights between, I think you said, the November 69 and April 70, and basically is more short term, but seems to be packed with action. And I wonder how the archive kind of reflects this, because you have one man. I'm not sure if Fadini has an archive too.
Yes, there are documents from Fadini's archive in common. Yeah. Yeah,
because in that, it would be interesting to see how one person is really keeping this kind of long-term fight, really. I mean, struggle is the word I was looking for, and the other one just comes in for these months and basically, I don't know, almost takes over and is inspiring. And I wonder if this sort of transpires and how this is. I'm a bit more interested about the archival sort of feeling behind all this.
Well, I don't know if the archive itself reflects these different temporalities. What we were trying to do was to, probably this was something, a limit of our let's say approach, that we tried pretty much to put an accent on similarities than on differences between documents and between the different protagonists of the scene. Even if you explore in Common Atlas, you will see huge multitudes of aesthetic choices. You know, like Carmelo Bene is at odds with any aesthetic choice that Scabbia makes, for example, or I don't know, and so on and so forth. So it's not that there is a homogeneity. You will see the richness produced during that period. But I don't know. But you somehow you make a point. Why? Because researching the work of Scabbia also beyond those years and deep into the 70s, Scabbia was a man of 68, but did not understand the 70s, or let's say, or he understand them very well. Meaning, he was completely involved into the social struggles of 1968 and 1969, to the point that his diaries is theater in the space of struggles. So he really wanted to practice this spazio degli scontri. So he wanted to be at the center of the agon. Someone spoke about the agon yesterday. While when things became, let's say, hardcore during the 70s in terms also of violence, in terms of armed options, in terms of repression, he decided not to become impolitical, but interestingly enough, to abandon the cities and to invest in itinerant projects of participatory theater in the countryside and in the mountains. So somehow you really see here the shift between, again, participatory theater as conflict, as a moment of class struggle, without denying its aesthetic autonomy. Because the interesting thing about Scabbia is that he always retained his role as an artist, as a poet, as an author, as a director. But anyway, so you can see 68, 69, and 70 very committed to this space of struggles. In the 70s, somehow worried about how radical things were getting in the social agon, he turned to, I would say, more rural places, practicing, put into practice what he learned in the cities, in participatory projects that were more about reconstructing what he felt as the broken social fabric of communities. So yeah, but...
No, actually that was, no, I was not interrupting you. I was thinking.
Oh, I finished.
No, actually that was one of my questions. I will open to the audience after, but which was about, one is the role of women. If you have many, like here, independent theater and decentralization here, haven't been or have been historicized as mainly a man affair. There's some women, but it's much easier to go and find men. So this is a question for that period, I do believe. So this, so role of women, and then another thing, if you have some figures like the cook or activity, as we were saying, the reproduction of social fabric, like kids, cooking, all this, which is here during the revolution, it's a bit of a part of what some theater groups are working with. For instance, at Teatro da Comuna, the cook was a central figure from what they told us, so that's kind of an interesting thing. So this, another question I do have has to do with the very structure of conditions of production of your project, which was the fact that it was an IRC project, which are difficult and very big projects, and if that changed the way you worked, or was that how did that conductions of how did that affect it in a good way and in a bad way what you did? This is another question. And finally, when we were working with the period, a lot of things happen. And if you, how do you see failure, disillusion, which is something that happens all throughout this long term? Like if you, like mourning of the revolution, how is this present in your archive, or if you've
the mourning
of the end of the revolution,
okay.
and if this is an issue that you can feel through these archives?
Yes. The role of women. I mean, we wanted women to have the role they should have in the narration of those years. Of course, those years were the years of the developing of feminism. Let's think, for example, of the incredible contribution that our critics such as Carla Lonzi did, not only for the arts, by founding probably the first Italian feminist collective, Rivolta Femminile, and by writing a few years before 1968 an article that is very well known for her book Self-Portrait, which again thinks of our critic not as the writing of one individual author text, but thinks our critic as a dialogue which is edited between the art critic and artists, based on friendship and closeness of relationships. So it was a true revolution back then. And she wrote the famous article that says, that is titled "Art Critique is Power." Mm-hmm. So equating, again, there's the disciplinary take of the performative power of writing on art as possessing art, as imposing over art. Mm. So, and of course, if you think of the architecture of the archive, the feminist contribution was and is crucial for the result that we achieved, and also in terms of documents and characters that emerge from people that emerge from the archive. Let me just mention, for example, Lina Mangiacapre, who was a very radical feminist performer, which worked always outside institutional circuits with her group Le Nemesiache, which is completely unknown to any official historiography of theater. So, for example, if you go to the shape of community view, you can choose the visualization of two possible networks. One is the historiographic network, and the other one is the in common network. The historiographic one is much bigger because, of course, it relies on simply, it was a very, very long work of checking all the literature, but the in common community, if you want to visualize that community, will give you some presences which are completely forgotten by the official historiography. For example, Lina Mangiacapre is one of these cases of radical women performers which were completely obliterated in history. Yeah. Sorry, what are the others?
The other question was IRC, and the other was disillusion.
Well, disillusion. Disillusion is a big part of the thing. I'm thinking about 1979, if I'm not wrong, piece by Sudano is another great, very important actor and author in the scene of the avant-garde theater of the 60s. That was titled Mors Due, so Death Number 2. And it was all about basically the disillusions of Marxism in a moment in which it was highlighting for example, the illusionary effects of participation, of democratization of theater, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. I think we simply included the sense of mourning and loss in the archive, because I think it would be completely wrong to erase it, to simply exclude it, and to give it like a sort of happy ending narrative. We include this mourning. We made him present as a part of what, not only of how the historical reading of those years worked, labeling them as years where, again, loss, disappearance, death, violence were ruling, but also the sense of loss that the protagonists of that season felt when all of a sudden everything ended in 1977. What we tried to do was we tried to counter the official narration that sense of loss was the result of a decade of irrational violence that was erasing all the constituent radical experiments that were happening all around in politics, in life, in art, in theater, in performance. So this was what we tried to communicate. And this, again, this is also the understanding of that period by some of the protagonists. So again, it is not something to erase, but it's something to include, to problematize, and also it is important to represent alternatives to this understanding of the period.
Okay, and the last was IRC.
I mean, the ERC, this is really a question that you should ask Annalisa Sacchi, okay, the PI. I mean, I came late into the project. I came late in the second year, so I did not participate to writing. I was not administrating the project. So I got all the beautiful part, and it didn't have the heavy part. But I think Annalisa was incredible in managing the project, was incredible in managing the team of researchers, and I mean, props to her. If I can tell you something from my personal point of view, I did not feel the weight of bureaucrats on my shoulders while researching. I did not feel that we were running out of money, or that we had to spend more money otherwise. So I think it was just a great, a great path for me.
More questions?
Well, first of all, a compliment, because it's really a fantastic atlas, a fantastic archive. I had been there already because Anna is really fan of it, and while we were preparing our project, obviously some of these models, well, let's use that word, were very important for us. One thing that I think it's we understand when we are navigating in the atlas, across the atlas, but maybe you could say a few words about that. Is the fact that there is a balance in the archive between the freedom of searching and finding documents, and I think that I would add another question to this one, which is you pointed out that students, young students in performing arts, will probably look at all this material in a different way from yours that you were involved in the research, or us that are interested in archiving issues. But we have that freedom. We are discovering, and we are affected by the images and the connection and the possibilities that we have to link them and link the text and so on. But at the same time, we have the feeling that
the research was very, I don't know, deep, because you have anyway chosen the way we can enter. We may privilege feminism on another issue, another theme, but nevertheless, you know the documents, and you told that you have been choosing in the notebooks to connect documents with the images or of the performances with the notebooks. But it's really something that I feel very important, because you don't propose a narrative, a single narrative, or other narratives, and that counter part concerning the official historiography is we feel that it exists, that position, perspective, but at the same time it's in the present. You designed the archive today, so documents talk with you and you made them talk, but at the same time it's our present that is looking at that moment. So I think it's a great job. It's fantastic, because of that. I feel that balance. I feel that I can go ahead and look for things about Carmelo Bene, but at the same time, maybe I think I should go through this way because it's proposed. Maybe there's something there interesting that I don't know, or that is going to stimulate my imagination or my knowledge and so on.
Thank you. First of all, thank you. This is definitely one of the objectives we had. First of all, despite this very creative aspect of the archive, we wanted it to be usable. So there is like a normal catalog in which all visual is very important. Even in the catalog view, you visualize a series of the documents, but you can search your own way as if we were, let's say, in a traditional archive. And speaking of narratives and freedom to roam it, I mean, this. I think you have a point. If you see this balance, I'm happy, because I was worried that this balance was totally gone. Because what I can tell you is that this is a situated archive. So I mean, and we make no secret of how and on how this archive is situated. Which I think, I mean, it makes it more honest, if you want, than those archives who, like 99% of archives who present themselves as objective, you know, as impartial objectives, collections of items. But yes, I hope a certain balance is still present, and our situatedness is not overwhelming the possibility, the use of the archive. Yes.
More questions? Paula.
I just wanted to thank you for Maria João in the same, well, this aspect of the what I would call aesthetic care, which is connected with this situatedness. But going a little bit back in the conversation, I wanted to still grab this expression that I think is so generative. It's a whole programme de désordre absolu, which is the complicity, be complicit in dissonance, which I think it's really, really very important for this position of, or this work of uncancelling the potential of that period, which the which the historiography, the predominant historiography has enclosed or depotentialized. And so this kind of proposals that, in a way, wrap up all this huge amount of work that it was both present here in your presentation. I also wanted to comment on that, the breadth, the length, the endurance that I was feeling. It was a long presentation.
Sorry about it.
No, I don't. You see, it's a compliment,
Okay.
because you held it in a way that was it was beautiful, with precision, and we could feel I'm pulling this through. I don't know if that's important to you, but I think it's an important aspect of how you engage, how you do this, how you share this, which is also then in the whole work in the very archive. What else did I want to say? I think that's one thing that I wanted to ask, which is kind of explicit, or for us to see and to listen to, is the way you engaged the notion of critical fabulation from Saidiya Hartman. I don't know if you can say, if you feel like it.
Of
otherwise, thank you.
I just simply loved the book by Hartman, Wayward Lives, and I think the way she works with archival material is incredible. I mean, the idea that, and also there's a shift, the idea that you can, as an historian, not as a fiction writer, you can integrate archival material with fiction. I mean, I simply love it. And I love the fact that she says none of the facts that you will read in this book are invented, though some are fictional. And the fact that this fictionality invests the intimacy, the way also she says, she pushes at the limits of the case file, how she brings the archive to the extreme. I think it's very inspirational. And I just felt like it was interesting to mention it, especially because she's not an artist. Because, you know, like performing archives is easy for some, it's not easy, but I mean, we expect it from artists or from curators, but we don't usually expect it from historians. And this is something great from a point of view of research, very useful. About the length of my speech, I wrote it down. I usually don't read, but I was extremely anxious when she told me that it got 1 hour. Thought I was like 15 minutes in a panel with other people. So she told me you got 1 hour. I was very anxious, so I overwrote stuff, but that's again typically me. And so what was the first Programme de désordre absolu, the program of absolute disorder. So this is the title of the new book by Françoise Verger. Yeah, and
I was just making the connection between this notion of that felt like, for me, in relation to the book by Vergès, the notion of Programme de désordre absolu, that felt like very accurate. The notion of complicit dissonance as a program, not only the identification of the situation or as a way of describing this period, but also as a program of how to do archival work to keep this.
But it is also somehow very, and in addition to what you say, is also very, somehow very questioning, very radical, because it means, the expression is from Frantz Fanon. She uses the expression by Frantz Fanon, and she uses it in order to say the European Museum is not reformable. So, I mean, we also, as people working with these institutions, maybe we do not work with museums, we work with universities and theaters. I think we must take into consideration this abolitionist wave that comes from
something else.
Yeah. To do, and of course, there's also abolitionism always means to create something new. And again, looking back at those years, for example, in Italy in the 60s and the 70s, were not abolitionists, because this is somewhere, it happened somewhere else, but were very critical of existing institutions and very inventive in terms of new institutionality, in terms of new ways of organizing society and arts and aesthetics. So I think that when we say programme de désordre absolu, then it entails that we are coherent with it. And then we create some of this disorder, and we create some, no, new order is a bad word, but you know, something new anyway.
In the 70s in Italy, the novelty was very violent. I mean, it ended up with the Brigate Rosse, and Toni Negri leaving Italy, running away and never coming back. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
Absolutely. I'm not a fan of violence. I myself, I don't even know how to throw a punch. So I agree with you. But again, what I'm concerned with is that this understanding, it has been the only understanding of those years and has blocked more, I would say, a more critically exact historical evaluation of those years. Exactly, and again, for example, equating Toni Negri with the Brigate Rosse is like equating, I don't know, Picasso and Miro. So they're two completely different options concerning politics. Indeed, Toni Negri wrote something against the Brigate Rosse when he was in jail, because Toni Negri was absolutely not a non-violence, but was again any option of, you know, armed struggle or of avant-garde armed struggle. He included violence as part of politics, but you know, not the terroristic option. So a totally different type of violence, which was much more a mass violence, which is totally different. And also this ambiguity was used by the state also to put an end to social movements in Italy, to equate everything to terrorism, which was absolutely not the case. And the autonomia, as you know, you had, of course, you had people that went to demonstration with guns, not denying it. Of course, that's historical, and I don't hope this tends to come back, of course. But it also had an amazing, it also gave an incredible contribution to art and creativity. I think, for example, that if we take the so-called Mao Dadaismo, which was this ironical movement that was part of the movement of the 70s, you really have the first, let's say, one of the most effective example of avant-gardes without proper names. So really, like avant-garde languages that were used, that were socially used in a shared way, without individualities, but they were conveyed through free radios, through magazines, through zines, and so on and so forth. So I mean, and some of the work of the archive is to make this richness available without, of course, being any supporter of violent options. But you know, we think this is also good service to a better historical recalling of that period, which has been ideologically marked. I mean.
Thank you so much. I totally agree, and I was, of course, thinking of the period of the revolution and the various iterations of its commemorations and the way, the consecutive ways it was been closed and closed and closed and reduced more and more and more to an excess, to some juvenile phase, and etc. So I do believe in our experience with archives. I think it shows that there's a lot of work to do with the actual materials, with the actual histories, and with that we see the richness and an inventiveness of an entire period where there's a lot of things, a lot of tonalities. Of course, there's conflict for sure, and it's so obvious that there's conflict, so that the memory of the very period was like blocked. So it's for obviously that there is there are counter memories, but I think that part of our work is actually to grasp, to look again, to inquire, and to open it up for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.